in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Palm Industries. I have maintained for a long time that pepper spray is a way underused tool in law enforcement, and I get it. When you have to arrest someone, you do not want to have to get that stuff on you. But in personal defense or concealed carry scenarios, you want to create standoff and increase the distance, not go hands-on. I can tell you hundreds of stories about confrontations I have been involved with in real life that were resolved with some form of less lethal long before a gun would have been an option. Why not carry some in your pocket? Palm pepper spray is small, easy to carry, and it's effective. If you need something in between harsh words and a gun, this is a $12 solution. It's available on Amazon, makes a great gift. Go check them out at palmpepperspray.com. That's palm, P-O-M, pepperspray.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com. So Mike, how's your guitar stuff doing, man? Like, are we finally going to get that concert episode where you're going to play for us, the one you promised us?
Totally.
Oh,
Ready?
Oh, dang.
You ready for this?
Yeah? Yeah. Let's do it.
It's not going to be that exciting, I promise. But this is good because I did an episode about wellness while Jim was away, and
I feel very healthy and balanced now that I listened to that episode.
I
It's
hope
good.
so. There's a lot of vibes, right? Like the vibes from the guitar.
That's right. My chakra is centered.
I don't know what that means, but
Me neither.
let's go with it.
Something about my yoni. I don't know. I read that in a magazine once.
So the wellness thing, one of the topics that I talked about was like having good outlets and a hobby, right? And we've talked about how I play guitar. That's one of my outlets. And it's been something that has just been over the last couple of years. I'm not like any kind of pro or expert or anything like that, but it has absolutely become a staple of my mental health. And to be clear, I'm not a good guitar player. I've only been playing for like a minute, but...
Oh, I think you're a good one.
Okay. I mean, it's relative. I mean, that's a skill.
He's legit.
Yeah. It's a skill thing, right? Like we'll talk about that. It's relative, right? But it's become a thing that brings me joy, and it helps me decompress and divert my brain somewhere other than like work and house chores and podcasting and being a dad. And I'd always wanted to learn how to play. I tried for like 5 minutes when I was a kid, but it didn't really go anywhere. I couldn't stick with it. But a big part of the push that got me there was I wanted my son to be exposed to music at a young age and to have like kind of an ear for it, right? And when he was a baby, I'd sit there like when he was awake at night, crying, upset, like feeding him middle of the night kind of thing. I'd open up YouTube and I'd pull up like a music video and I'd play it for him and it would calm him down. And he'd just stare at these videos, which I thought was cool.
For comparison, I use jet noise with my kids, like
of
for
course
real,
you did.
like the white noise. Yeah,
Of course you did.
I tried to find prop noise, but that wasn't available on iTunes at the time. Back in the day.
Well, with time, my kid started to learn how to like talk a little bit, verbalize things, and he would essentially ask for songs that I would play him sometimes on my phone. Like he would know words or phrases that he would repeat and clearly try to like indicate that's what he wanted to hear.
Yeah, and for my kids, they ask for a GE F110 turbofan and full afterburner, right? Like
obviously,
that's what they know. Yeah, obviously.
Yeah. But like to this day, watching a song is still part of the bedtime routine when I put him to bed. And music has always been a thing that I turn to when I want to relieve stress, whether that's driving in the car, blasting some music, or out on the patio with a beverage. I almost always have some kind of music going. And so knowing that, my now ex-wife, my baby mama, got me a guitar for my first Father's Day, and now I own a few, and I can't put them down. So That's where I'm at.
So is it like shooting where if you buy more guitars, then you are just better at being guitarist? Like if I buy another gun, then I'll be better at guns?
Well, it's not just another one, but also like I really got to trick it out like the most expensive guitar possible, right?
Yeah, and all the accessories, right? You got to get the good amp, you got to get like the right chords, those little like the little triangle things that you hit the strings with.
Totally. Guitar pick. Yeah,
that thing.
No, I mean my guitar that I got was like $100 or $150 used thing off of like Facebook Marketplace. Nothing fancy. But taking this a step further, this would not be a Tactical Tangents episode, obviously, if I didn't nerd out on some stuff.
Oh God!
And you know damn well
is this
that
like
I'm going to use
like the OODA loop helps you guitar. Is that where we're heading?
Yeah,
okay.
You know damn well that I'm going to use some of this to draw some like actual training material out of it. So settle in because there's some real life implications in this. We're going somewhere. Just accept that. And as it relates to useful lessons, we're going to talk about concepts that you can use to aid in any kind of skill development. I think from the wellness perspective, building talent in something that brings you joy is a big part of it. Having a hobby or an outlet is a big part of it. And that absolutely plays into the happiness, wellness equation for sure. But also there are a lot of parallels when it comes to skill development, whether that is a skill that you're trying to build for work or for fun. And maybe more importantly, if you are a coach or a trainer of some kind and you're looking to help your students reach their full potential, there's a lot to be said about what you can take out of this sort of thing. So we're going to talk about things like balancing some of the fundamentals. Sometimes they counter each other, and sometimes there's a balance that you have to strike between keeping things simple and working on more advanced or technical skills. We're going to talk about the crawl, walk, run philosophy, which is, I'm sure, something that most of our listeners have heard of. And understanding that sometimes less is more. I think there's a point of diminishing returns in training a lot of times that you need to recognize and be able to dial back and be like, maybe we're good for the day, or maybe that's enough. Maybe that's good enough. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We're going to talk about that. Joy, like keeping training fun and having making people feel successful, like they're making progress, that plays into it a lot. And one of the big ones, or the other things, is like resilience and tenacity. Sometimes you just got to start and stick with it and trust the process, and just the grind is part of it. And you're going to hit plateaus and you got to break through that. So you have to work through it. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah. So learning is a thing that humans do, and that we humans are generally pretty good at. But you've probably noticed some of us are better at it than others, or at least seem to be. And some people seem to pick up skills quicker than others. This is a thing we should understand really well. But I'm surprised how often we suck at learning and teaching skills.
Yeah.
And we don't learn the act of learning, and we don't learn the act of teaching real well. And it doesn't matter what the skill is. Guitar, landing an airplane, shooting, first aid tasks, room clearing, nuclear war, public speaking, doesn't matter. They're all skills. And there's a way you develop any skill. I am particularly interested in how we teach someone who is struggling a little, right? There's kind of a bell curve in learning. There's going to be one extreme that just picks things up right away. And there's another extreme that just no matter what you do, they're never going to pick it up. Most people are somewhere on the curve. That's why it's a bell curve. And I'm always interested in how do you help the guys who are they're almost there. That's interesting to me. And especially because a lot of these skills,
right?
What's that?
The turning points. There's a turning point, breaking through a plateau. That's a big thing.
And a lot of these skills aren't natural. Landing a plane is not a thing most people can innately do well. You can watch YouTube videos about it. You can explain the science of it, and you can still prang it in. I know because I've done it, right? you need to know what to do with your hands and your eyes, and you need to know the science of it so well that you're not thinking about the science of it while you're doing it. And some people, like I said, just never nail it. Now, when we deal with learning, I don't want to be in a fair fight with that skill. I want to stack the deck in my favor and give myself the best possible chance of success in my skill building journey. And that's what this is. It's a journey.
Yeah. I think that learning as a skill is important. And if you talk to people who are talented in different things, like you'll find that they're good. They could learn just about anything that they want to. The people that are really good at things are really good at a lot of things in many cases. So when I talk about learning how to play and exposing my kid to this kind of thing early, that didn't come out of nowhere. There's a couple places that I draw from in those areas. There's a few books in particular. Two are very related, but different. One is called Talent is Overrated. The other one is called The Talent Code, which is a little bit more about coaching than just the talent by itself, but both have interesting points. And there's another one called The Art of Learning, and that one's written by Joshua Whiteskin.
You can tell this is Mike's jam. Yeah. Learning about learning is like his happy place. He digs this stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of my thing. I'm all about it. But all three of those books were recommended to me from a high-ranking, high-performing special ops dude who knows how to apply this stuff in real life. So it's not coming from a purely recreational place. We're talking about the music side of it because it's kind of fun and because I think the hobby thing plays into it. But there's a lot to be said about the crossover, right? So reading up on this stuff, you'll learn that a lot of your aptitude and predisposition towards certain traits or skills are a product of your environment growing up. If you look at high performers like Tiger Woods or the Manning brothers or Mozart, you'll learn that they were exposed to things like golf and football and music at a very young age by usually their dads or their parents in some capacity, right? And it's easy to make an argument based on that because their parents were professional players or whatever, that there's something about their genetics. And there's certainly some play in that, right? There's a good debate for nature versus nurture.
Michael Phelps, he's got some genetics, like his foot is the size of my whole body, right?
Yeah.
Like,
and he's like 9 feet tall or something like that.
Yeah.
And just like if like Mike or Jim are never going to be professional basketball players. Like we're not 6'8", right? But in addition to that, they were also immersed in this stuff from a very young age. And that exposure cannot be discounted. If you consider that like Mozart became a famous composer at 17 or 18 years old or whatever it was, but he'd already been doing music for like 10 or 12 years or whatever. Like that's a long time.
I like that word immersion. Like when you're learning a language, there's, you go to class once a week, you go to class maybe for an hour a day throughout a week, you get a lot more, or you go live in Mexico for a week and you get so much more. I grew up in a house full of judges and lawyers. I was bombarded with legal stuff all day, every day. I'm not a lawyer. Don't play one on TV, but I did experience what that immersion. True. I did experience what that immersion felt like. Right.
Yeah. So if you consider that like people like that, even though they might still be young, 17, 18 years old, whatever, like college football players, something like that, like they have a pretty extensive amount of experience by that point. And they've also had a lot of help. They had coaching when they were little kids from their fathers who were professional players themselves and who know what they're doing, right? So people like that, their knowledge is intuitive and implicit. By then it comes pretty easy because they had already done a whole bunch of work to get there.
Yeah. As it relates to teaching kids, my kids are 7 years old and 8 years old, a girl and a boy. And we're doing a ton of skill building in my house, whether that's reading or doing little STEM or craft kits or riding a bike or learning how to wipe your ass, which is a skill like you'd think they would nail that at age 2.
I can confirm.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Yep. So at age 42, I still haven't. Or like riding a bike without training wheels or getting steady on the this wheeled hoverboard things they got for Christmas. Santa brought them for Christmas. I come at all of those as an opportunity to teach them not just the skill, but how to learn a skill. Even when it gets hard or it feels like everyone else is getting it but them, like that's the magic of it, is every time we learn a skill, we are making a point of learning like, no, this is how we learn the skill.
Yeah, and what that feeds into is the idea of like having a growth mindset. And we've talked about that a lot before. Having a growth mindset is a big deal. And skill building, like kids, adults, whatever, who get to that point have developed that growth mindset. That's what helps them apply to new things and get out of their comfort zone and all of that, right? And the concepts of deliberate practice is another thing that we've talked a lot about in terms of building expertise. And these are all things that I've read about and applied to my professional world when it comes to things like shooting and tactics. And more importantly, when it comes to things like teaching or coaching shooting and tactics. And my understanding of those things have 100% applied to learning how to play guitar. There's a connection in this in terms of practical lessons that we can take from a hobby, right? Or from our professional setting and apply to a hobby. Yes, it brings me joy. It makes me happy. I enjoy these things, right? But there is a lot of crossover. And perhaps more importantly, these concepts are something that enabled me to develop a hobby that became not only a good outlet for me and provide joy and all those things and be happy, but it also reinforced those lessons, right? It reinforced that like, okay, these things are real, right? Because there's no one sitting here judging like my guitar playing per se.
Oh, I'm judging.
Yeah, well, Jim is judging me, obviously. Yeah. And now there's some of it that's like been recorded for the first time ever. But the thing is that like it reinforces those lessons. Like they're not created in a vacuum, and these are real.
I want to address growth mindset. Mike's mentioned that a couple times. This concept has kind of evolved, and each generation kind of approaches it a little differently. In my house, back in the day, when I was a kid, there was a big emphasis, just a mindset of natural talent. You were either good at a thing or not. You either picked up the trumpet and figured it out, or you didn't. I didn't. When I was in 4th grade and tried out for school band, 3 weeks into it, the band teacher took me aside. I was like, this is not your thing. And that was the end of my musical career, right? And that attitude still invades my thinking. I recognize that in myself, that I'm like, oh, I'm just not good at this. I'll say things
really
like that to myself,
deal, right?
Yeah.
Really big deal.
And it's one of the reasons I keep Mike around, not just because he's a silver-haired fox, but because he has taught me, ironically, that it's okay to suck at a thing for a while,
but also fuck that
until
guy.
You get until you get good at it, right? Like that's okay. And saying, yeah, I suck and that's fine, and I'm going to get through that. He really genuinely embraces the growth mindset, and he reminds me to do the same. And so like having a friend and ally and partner in this journey has been big for me. So growth mindset is more than just saying to yourself, like, I can learn. It is reframing all of this process into something positive, right? Having a positive mental attitude toward the inevitable failures and frustrations in the process of growing. Oh, I screwed that up. That's a good thing because I learned something from it, right? And it's easy for me to say that, like in flying, I can debrief and have a healthy attitude toward it. But when I try to like learn a tango, not so much. I'm like, oh, I just suck at dancing or whatever.
Well, and the other thing that plays into is when this is like work or professional setting, there's a lot more at stake, right? And like the give a shit factor is a lot higher because like I have to get good at this thing or I'm going to lose my job, or I have to like develop this skill or I'm not going to make it anywhere or whatever. So part of that growth mindset is understanding that there's more than just like that like minimum requirement, right? And when it comes to like something like a hobby, and this is why I think it's a good crossover, because a lot of the people that get into the lines of work that Jim and I do, and probably a lot of our listeners, like we're pretty passionate, driven people. We're pretty enthusiastic and eager and motivated and all those things. And when it comes to something like a hobby, like usually one of the barriers to people getting started is it's some combination of like time and money, right? Like I don't have the time or I don't have the money. And if they do make those like low level investments, like, okay, I bought a $100 guitar and I'm going to mess with it like a few minutes a week or something like that. At some point they hit a plateau or they get frustrated, they hit a brick wall and they never get past that. Those obstacles are the things that we have to learn how to work past when it comes to growth mindset.
A couple of things, just using shooting as an example. They spend $1,000 on a gun, an extra $1,000 on accessories, and then they don't go get a bunch of training and get good at it. They don't get themselves over the hump.
Right.
So they get it and they don't like get attached to it. They don't make it part of their routine. And then they just kind of sit. Another thing that they'll run into is social media. They'll go on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever the kids are doing, and they'll hit what we call a gatekeeper. Someone who's like, well, you're not as good as I am. You're a noob. And get discouraged because they said something dumb or embarrassing and they don't feel like they're part of like the tribe of that hobby. I've seen that a lot too.
Yeah. And that's like 100% part of the problem. And whatever the obstacle or the barrier is, a lot of the plateaus that people hit or the frustrations that people hit, like sometimes it takes a few tries. Sometimes you have to explore a few different hobbies or a few different avenues, right? Even careers. A lot of times people like experiment with a couple different careers and like, this is not really the thing that I'm like, yeah, I could probably do it, but it doesn't bring me that joy, right? It doesn't click. They don't stick with it, whatever that is. But in a lot of cases, the hardest part is to start. And once you get going, you have to expect that there are going to be obstacles and shortfalls and challenges, because of course there are. Because if it was anything cool enough and it was easy, everyone would do it, right? And that's the thing about hobbies. It's like you have to appreciate some of that growth and the struggle and recognize that the payoff is worth it. And such is true in both professional settings as well as personal settings. So stay the course.
Yeah. This also goes into kind of our ongoing discussion across the episodes about process, right? Some people are very process oriented. Some people are very results oriented. Skill development is a process. It is a journey. Now, if you start a thing expecting immediate dramatic success, like I often do, you are setting yourself up for failure. If you start a thing, be like, how hard could it be? Well, you might surprise yourself, but more often you're like, ooh, this actually is hard. About the time, you hit a level of proficiency where you start figuring out just how hard it is. I am a compulsively results-oriented person, and I have to deliberately and consciously remind myself to trust the process and not try to jump to the end. You have to kind of reframe your failures and your frustrations into wins. And that's not easy. You have to really deliberately think about it. But that's the difference between someone who gets good and someone who just doesn't, is that exact thing.
Yeah. And if you dive into deliberate practice and expertise and all these things, you'll find that like in terms of plateaus and frustrations, like you have to work on the edges of your comfort zone, because that's where the growth happens. Like you need some of that, right? And it's not to say that there aren't times where you should just like dumb it down and have fun with it. Sure, that's a thing. But if you want to get good, you have to push yourself a little bit. One of the biggest limitations in my little musical journey that I've been on is that I have been essentially self-taught, right? Like, and to be clear, I'm not one of those freaks who just tinkered with my guitar and did it all by ear and just figured shit out. Like, that's not me at all. I learned from teachers on YouTube mostly, but one of the critical things about that was most of that learning was done one way, Like they were teaching me stuff and it's missing the coaching and the feedback that is essential to learning. And when it comes to like guitar and or a hobby, like I can record myself, I can take video or record audio and I can listen back to it and hear where my errors are and how much I mess something up. But when it comes to things of consequence, things like shooting or tactics or flying or medicine, feedback and coaching is a critical component. And that's something that you definitely don't want to skimp out on.
Now, consider that practice makes permanent. So if Mike is fingering his instrument wrong and he doesn't know it, he is developing habits, and those habits might get really hard to break later on when he does get coaching. So consider that. Practice makes permanent. Speaking of practice, we need to talk about reps and sets. There's some stat, and I think there's a book that says you need to practice a physical skill something like 10,000 times to master it. Now, that is kind of true. You need 10,000 good, thoughtful reps with coaching and feedback, and it can't just be that one physical task. It has to be integrated into all the other tasks, including under pressure. That practicing until you quote-unquote can't get it wrong, that is what you're seeking, right? If you want to get a really high level of competence, you have to immerse yourself in it. You have to get a little bit obsessed with it.
Yeah, and there's a key part of this, and the reason that I bring up the coaching and the feedback thing is a good coach can find that, right? Like the right type of like, how much is good enough, right? Practicing until you can't get it wrong. Like there are times that you can make it simple enough and be like, okay, they've definitely got this level down, this fundamental down, or this level of competence, they are absolutely there, right? To go to the next level. But I just want to jump back for a second and talk about the attitude part when it comes to growth mindset stuff, because that's another thing that the coaches can help with, right? Like if someone is reaching that like, okay, hey, you got to do this 10,000 times or for 10,000 hours or whatever it is, like that can feel insurmountable to a new student.
Absolutely. That is gatekeeping in itself. Well, if you haven't done it 10,000 times, you're not going to get good.
Right. And so like,
you don't have to do it 10,000 times. You have to do it one more time.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing about like their attitude and that growth mindset. How do you condition the right attitude, the right mindset to be like, okay, like, hey, I'm not worried about rep 10,000 right now. I'm worrying about rep +1, +2, +5, wherever we're at. And like, let's work on that. And if we can break through that, then the next few hundred are not going to be a big deal. And like in terms of guitar, like I remember, we'll talk about like guitar stuff as we go, but a B minor chord, right? It's a more difficult chord for a beginner like me to play.
What does it sound like?
A B minor? Let's see.
Yeah.
It sounds like...
Yeah.
Hopefully I got that right.
All right.
A B minor chord, right? It's a more difficult chord to play. But if I worried about like, hey, I need to learn 5,000 chords. Okay, well, that's not helpful. I'm not working on 5,000 chords, though. I'm working on that one chord today. So, like, that's where a good coach, I think, really plays into this, like, 10,000 hours thing. And that's a generalization. It doesn't necessarily take 10,000 hours or 10,000 reps, but it's something to consider in terms of, like, it can feel insurmountable, but that's, like, a stepping stone to get there.
A key concept that we are kind of dancing around so far is the Dunning-Kruger effect, or the Dunning-Kruger curve. You can Google it. There are a lot of good memes about it on the internet, because the internet is a place you get to really see the Dunning-Kruger curve. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a common cognitive bias where early in competence building, when you're building a skill, people get this false confidence thing going. They start getting it, and they feel like they've nailed it, but they don't know how much they don't know. And that gets you a lot of unwitting errors. People will also, in this phase, when they get to that top of that curve, they'll start giving each other bad advice. They're like, oh, I got it. I'm going to try to help you do it this way. And they're they're not helping anyone because they don't know what they're screwing up. And it also gets you this drop in motivation because you're like, oh, I got it. I don't need to work anymore. Yeah. But again, you don't know how much you don't know. You have to get up and over that curve and start making mistakes and start doing it under pressure and start doing it under different circumstances and letting it get a little weird. Get into the walk, get into the run.
Let it get weird.
Yeah. And then you really do start to grow and you really do start to nail it. Another way of thinking about this is unwitting incompetence. You might also hear it called unconscious incompetence, right? And then there's witting incompetence, and then there's witting competence, and then unwitting competence. That was a lot of words, a lot of sounds like the same word over and over. Forgive me, but words matter.
So let me phrase this in order the way that I've heard it. It is You kind of go from this arc of unconscious incompetence. You have no idea what you know or don't know, right? And then conscious incompetence. You still don't know what you're doing, but you're aware of how much you don't know. And then conscious competence, you have to work really hard at it, but you understand what you need to do and you're pretty much there. And then that unconscious competence where you know what you're doing without really even thinking about it. It's intuitive and implicit. That's kind of the stages. That's how I've heard it described.
Yeah. And so, you start out, you don't even know what mistakes you're making. And then at some point you can at least identify the mistakes you're making, like Mike said, and you can kind of hear your coach's voice, or you can kind of coach yourself. That's an important step, right? And then you're performing with little to no error as long as you concentrate super hard. And then at some point you're performing with little error without even thinking about it. The trouble is when people think they've gone through this whole process and arrogantly think that they're on the far right side of it. Think about, for example, drivers. Think about all the shitty drivers out there who they don't even know they're shitty drivers, right? They went to driver's ed and driver training. They got their driver's license 40 years ago.
Conscious incompetence. I'm a terrible driver and I know it.
That's a stage of growth. That's good. That's part of Mike's driving journey, right? Or they're like, I'm so good at driving, I don't even need to look up from my phone. That's how good I am at driving. No, you're not. You're just not catching your errors, right?
Yeah. So the thing about that curve, when it comes to the little peaks and troughs of knowing what you're doing and reaching this point of I'm pretty good, right? And then falling in that slump of I'm not as good as I thought I was. There could be more than one. And the thing about those stages of competence is a lot of times you just don't realize how much you don't know, right? When I went to YouTube for the first time and I was just I went and searched beginner guitar lesson and I learned an E chord. This is an E chord. Well, what the fuck does that mean? Great. I know how to do an E chord. That doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know where that fits into the equation of music or how to make a song out of it, right? And then there was at some point where I was like, okay, I know a few chords I could do. There's an E minor, a G, a D, an A minor, a C. I know a bunch of chords, right? I know 4 or 5 chords and I can play those. But these guitar teachers on YouTube would be like, well, if you know these 3 chords or whatever, you can play 1 million songs. And I'm like, bullshit. I don't know. I can't piece any of those things together to make a song right now, right? But it took some time. And as I started to work on all right, now I know the chords. I know more chords than, let's say, Jim knows, right? Jim doesn't know maybe guitar chords. But
100%.
But now I got to figure out how to piece those together to do anything useful with it, right? And with a little bit more time, maybe I become a little bit more competent. And now I'm I have to work really hard at it. I have to practice. I can put together now I can transition between chords D to G, right? I could go D to G. That's okay. Now I could do. It sounds kind of like music, is it's not just one thing over and over and over again, right? but I can't do it like fluidly, right? And like with time, get a little bit better and you could kind of sort of start to play a melody, right? But you have to work a lot at it. And so there's stages. And that same thing happens whether it's a hobby like a guitar or shooting or fighting or driving. The same kind of stuff happens. You hit plateaus, you got to break through them.
Now, one thing to hit here is currency and recency. How long can you go between practices and still be good at a thing, right? If you're a shooter, how long can you go between range training days and still be like good, quote unquote, good at shooting? Or between flights and still be good at flying? There's a reason why the military and the FAA have currency requirements, right? And one of the things you're going to find is that changes over the course of your career. Maybe initially while you're still learning that task, even a day gap will affect your performance. And then as you get really, really good and you get a lot of reps and sets, maybe you can go a week or a month or even a couple of months and still be pretty good. But, you know, I've had days in the plane where, like, I could tell you exactly what I was doing wrong, but I was too rusty to get my eyes and my brain moving fast enough to fix it, right? I had regressed back to conscious incompetence. Hey, I know that I'm screwing this up. I can't fix it fast enough to matter, right?
It's not my day.
And you will see guys who are so far regressed that they don't even catch all the things they're screwing up, right? They regress all the way to unconscious incompetence or unwitting incompetence. And that's a thing you really got to watch for, especially in those critical skills.
Yeah. And so one thing about that, so what Jim is kind of leading into in terms of that stages of competence thing is sometimes it's a product of your analysis and sometimes it's a product of your intuition. And where you fall is a lot about like whether you can analyze on your own what you're doing right or wrong. And that's where a good coach really comes in, right? And then the other part of it is, can you apply some of those things intuitively, right? Like if I have to think very deliberately about where every finger goes to play an E chord, right? Or a G chord, like if I have to think about it very, very like I got to look down and like place one finger at a time versus it's just like I have that, like muscles don't have memory. I don't really like the term muscle memory, but like if you wanted to call it that, muscle memory of like, I don't have to think about it. I do it by feel in a sense, right? Automaticity, that's right.
And one thing with this, like flying an airplane. Flying an airplane is a fundamentally easy task. You can teach a kid to fly an airplane. You can teach a monkey probably to fly an airplane. The tricky part is when you're flying an airplane and trying to do something else with it. You're trying to move a bunch of cargo with it, or you're trying to drop a bomb with it, or you're trying to fly in a tight formation with it, right? If you're putting all of your brain bites into just flying the plane, what are you not putting your brain bites into? Integrating it into all the other things.
Right.
Right.
Well, and so this is where like being able to problem solve and having like a little bit of mental bandwidth while you do it, right? Like how intuitive is it? Do I have to think, does it occupy all of my bandwidth to do this one task? Or do I have a little bit left over to sort of like multitasking is not a great word, but like combine things a little bit, right? And so if you think about something like, we'll say shooting, right? Like shooting, or if you're a medic or a firefighter, right? Like starting an IV or taking a blood pressure or putting water on the fire, whatever it is that you do as part of your like normal skills. I'll use shooting because that's the one that I know really well.
I saw a YouTube video about the water on the fire thing.
Yeah. You want to put the water on the fire.
Do we have the video? Can we play the audio?
We have the video. We could play the audio for sure.
Let's do it.
I really want to be a firefighter so I could drive the fire SUV. Because I don't know what the fire SUV does when they get to the fire, like, yep, that's a fire. Confirmed, that is a fire. I guess we got to sit here and wait for the fire truck. So they can put some water on that, because this is just the SUV. Does not have a water hose. Those people going to burn up until the fire truck gets here. It's sad and unfortunate. What's on the radio? The dude in the fire SUV just directs people, which is pretty easy to do when you're dealing with fire. Like, hey guys, right there, where's that fire? I'd like for you to put water on it consistently until there's no more fire. And we want to take a similar approach right here. We want to put water on the fire until there's no more fire. They have meetings in the morning. Okay, guys, hypothetically, if it's fire right here, what we want to do is put water on the fire until there's no more fire. We're going to take the same strategy right here. We want to put water on the fire until there's no more fire. They had the same agenda for every meeting. They just white out the date.
So yeah, you want to put water on the fire. That's the lesson in that.
Nice.
But whatever the skill is, whether it's putting water on the fire or starting an IV or shooting or whatever, I imagine there have been little light bulb moments, right? Like if you think about shooting, I go back to that because again, that's the one that I know that kind of intuitively, right? Like there's those moments where you're like, oh, okay, I don't want to like jerk the trigger, anticipate the shot too much and like yank the shot. But if I grip tighter, then I can get away with a little bit more. There's little light bulbs where you can turn a corner. And so we'll talk about some examples, but we'll use those lessons to talk about how it applies to skill development in general. So I mentioned the grip and the trigger thing. This is a really like common thing. If you talk to world-class shooters, they'll tell you that they'll pull the trigger as hard and as fast as they want to because they're gripping the gun so hard that it's not going to move either way, right? Like it's basically in a vice in their hands. And so you can balance those things, right? You get away with a little bit more slap in the trigger if you have a nice tight grip. So you have to figure out like where are those tipping points, right? Another example, sight picture. There's a speed versus accuracy kind of component to this, right? Like you want a perfect sight picture if you're looking for an accurate shot at distance and you have all the time in the world. But in the combat sense, sometimes like more holes in basically the general area, like send it, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. So you're balancing some speed and accuracy. So when it comes to like guitar, if you think about, for example, picking individual like notes, right? Like, so if I use a song, this is a Stain song, right? So I can pick individual notes like that, right? But it takes a lot more brain power. But if I was singing along with the song, I can probably just like strum those strings. And you still basically get the idea, right? Like it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's good enough. So you can counter and balance some of those skills to make it work for the situation that you're in. Another big one that came for guitar stuff for me had to do with like strumming. And this is one of those like, okay, I can get like the as Jim says, the fingering right for a certain chord. I can get the fingering right, but like when it comes to putting those together into a song, there's like a whole rhythm component to it, right? Where you have to like try to strum it in the right, like you got to get this whole rhythm component down to it, right? And what I learned was like less is more. You don't necessarily have to have this perfect pattern. And a lot of times with a lot of skills, we want to make it very technical. We want like a math equation, right? And so in guitar, I would go on a lot of videos and I would see people talk about like a strumming pattern. It'd be like, okay, so the strumming pattern I'm using for this song is like down, 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 up, down, 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 up, down, down. And like you're trying to make, and it's on a count, right? It's a timing thing, right? So it's like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Man, it makes it very like mechanical. Whereas like what you're not doing is just kind of like just feeling the rhythm of the song. Like if you just except that I don't have to have that pattern exactly right as long as I have the timing right. There was one teacher that I came across on YouTube, and he explained that. He's like, stop at the strumming patterns, work on the timing. If you can get the timing right, you could just do the down strums. Just getting that right, you can add in the rest of it. Right? Like you can add the extra little notes to it as long as you get basically the timing right. So less is more in a lot of cases. And the same is true in shooting. My example of this for shooting is shooting on the move. You look at like a lesson plan for shooting on the move and people talking about, you got to do like a duck walk like a duck, talk like a duck. You got to walk on like the outside edges of your feet.
Quack.
Yeah, walk on the outside edges of your feet and do all these weird, funny things. And what I found is like, just walk, dude. Like the shooting is no different. Like grip, sights, trigger, grip, sights, trigger. It's not really that different. How fast or how abrupt you walk and move is going to affect your sight picture. So like if you smooth that out a little bit, you can shoot a little bit faster. There's a balance, but like don't overcomplicate it. You have to balance simplicity with the technical side of things.
When I think about turning points and light bulb moments as far as learning a skill, for both me and kind of interestingly also for my son, less so my daughter, usually the biggest turning point is after an intense period of frustration. Now, frustration is a funny thing. Like, I've heard this actually a lot in dog training, that one of the keys to teaching a dog is to kind of frustrate it a little bit. Apparently that is also quite true for me, right? So I go through not getting it and not getting it and not getting it and watching everybody else get it and getting mad at myself and mad at my coach and mad at the other guys who obviously had some hidden advantage and embarrassed and ashamed. And then I keep trying and eventually something just kind of works. I can't always explain why, right?
Yeah.
And then I usually have that skill better than the other guys because I've got more reps and sets at that point. And I can explain it better because I've heard it 1,000 different ways by that point. And I mentioned earlier about my kids getting these like hoverboard things for Christmas, like picture like a Segway, but without the hand grips, right? They're fun. They're really cool, but they're a little bit tricky at first. So they balance you. So if you try to balance you on top of it, you'll end up inducing an oscillation and it will buck you like a Bronco. And you will go flying. You have to overcome your instinct to balance and just let it work. Do less. My daughter figured that out in about 5 seconds. Jumped on it, started zipping around like she was born with it, right? My son took about 5 days. There was some crying. A little bit his, a little bit mine. It was a whole journey, right? And a lot of those 5 days was just telling him it was okay that he wasn't getting it. And me trying to be a good dad, I'm like, well, I'll teach him. That'll work. I'll get up on it and I'll show him how I figured out how to get up on it. And I did. And I did need to do that so I could understand, how to explain what to do with his toes and that kind of thing. But it turned out me saying, well, I could do it, didn't help him any. That was just one more person who was getting it instead of him. What worked was mom offering him candy if he stayed on it for 5 minutes. And that was the motivation.
Stick with it.
Here's a treat, stick with it. Here's a treat, stick with it, right? Find some joy, make it a game, make it a competition. My boy child will do anything if it involves winning. So give him that, right?
Yeah. Figuring out what motivates people goes a long way. And also, when it comes to coaching and trying to like teach people how to do something, there's a lot to be said about balancing that simplicity and technical stuff. Like I said earlier, I remember when I first learned how to snowboard, I was like, your feet are strapped into this board. You're trying to like turn in a certain way and like turn the other way and make your hips and angle the board a certain way. It's like, man, if you've never done it, it's one of those things that like would be really hard to explain to a person. And someone would just said like, hey, put your arms out to your side like an airplane. Now point your arms where you want to go. And like your hips just kind of follow your arms. Oh, weird. It just kind of works itself out. Like, that was so simple. It was such a simple thing, right? Like the value of good coaching in that sense. And one of the things this leads us into is that crawl, walk, run philosophy. If I'm teaching things like tactics or close quarters battle or hostage rescue, like room entry stuff, if I'm teaching that to a brand new, whether it's a cop or a new SWAT guy, a guy in SWAT school, something like that, there's a point at which I'm going to dumb things down to get them by and get the basic concepts, basic philosophy down. And as instructors and coaches, we have to like find that point where like, that's good enough. Like you've got a pretty good understanding of the fundamentals, and the fundamentals are fundamental. At the end of the day, when it comes to shooting, for example, what we see is people will fall apart when you take them into a shoot house because it's not a flat range anymore. And like the stuff on the flat range, like those safety rules, for example, apply the same way. There's nothing new in a shoot house. We're just applying it in a new context, right? And so like if you get those fundamentals down rock solid and you can apply them in like new and unique situations, then you can build the skills. And it's important to recognize that when you dumb things down and use that crawl, walk, run philosophy, that you're using that as a means to build skill and to eventually move on to the harder things, because that philosophy only works, like crawl only works if you eventually walk, and walk only works if you eventually run. You have to get there at some point.
Yeah, I have heard the phrase crawl, walk, run maybe 69 billion times in my career in the military. We love that phrase because it makes sense, right? We're going to have an iterative process and build a skill. But let's think about that a little bit because people screw it up. About crawl, think about the ideal way to teach someone to shoot. Not the way you learned, not the way the military does it, not the way the police academy does it. But the ideal way. What is the perfect way for someone to learn? Would you take them out to the range and start them live fire? Here's a Glock, point it that way and pull the trigger. Or would you start them in a classroom? Would you start with academics? This is the history of guns. This is the law as it relates to guns. This is the science of guns. This is internal ballistics, external ballistics, terminal ballistics. These are all the parts, the nomenclature. Would you use an inert trainer? Would you use a plastic blue gun or a Nerf gun? Would you have them use a laser pistol like a SIRT pistol or a Mantis? Would you use a simulator where they go into a live action role play scenario with this gun? And consider that there is real risk when we do live fire. So if you're trying to have a bunch of new students all crawl, how do you do it? Another thing with crawl, walk, run, I hear it a lot, but I hardly ever see it actually implemented. It reminds me a little bit of verbal judo, ask, tell, make. A lot of agencies, like law enforcement agencies, got away from that phrase because people weren't really following it. It ended up being ask, tell, lose your shit, overreact, fight the guy.
Yep.
Same way, interestingly, for a lot of the same reasons with crawl, walk, run. We spend a lot of time crawling because there's always some guy who isn't getting in. You got to work on him, right? And then everyone gets bored and frustrated and then goes right to running. And they can't figure out why the fundamentals are getting all screwed up. It's because they skip some steps, right? I know we all want to do the cool stuff. The cool stuff involves being able to get the fundamentals right even when things get weird. Right? It requires unconscious competence, which takes time, reps, disciplined practice. Do a day iteration before you do a night iteration. Do a dry iteration before you do a live iteration. Even when everyone's hot and tired and annoyed and bored, you still got to do it because when you skip steps, you add risk. One of the things I've noticed at work, kind of relating back to the shooting stuff, I work with a lot of smart dudes, like real smart dudes. It's unusual for the military, and very fast learners. And they tend to have excellent vision because they're aircrew guys, right? They to be a pilot, you have to have decent eyes. Oh, and also very competitive and maybe just a little bit arrogant.
No, pilots? Huh.
Yeah. So their shooting tends to be excellent. Like, seriously. Like, they're some of the best shots I've ever seen. They're good at manipulating machines. They're good at lining things up. They have good depth perception, that kind of thing. So they tend to be really, really good shots, but their weapon handling tends to be dog shit. They can follow the process to aim and shoot, so they very often and almost always shoot expert. But they sometimes make what I would describe as bonehead errors on safe weapon handling because they don't practice that. So they don't know even just basic like what to bring to the range because they don't do range day all the time, right? So things like, bring a snack, bring some sunblock, bring some earplugs, like those things tend to be afterthoughts. They also don't know how to troubleshoot a malfunction. So they can literally run. They can do like a run and shoot drill and do really well. They tend to be very athletic. Their numbers look really good, but their crawl and their walk are weak. So I would like to have seen like a week, and maybe that's unrealistic based on how busy training schedules are, but I would like to have seen a week of inert training up front where they just learn to get comfortable carrying and manipulating a weapon and build some of those tactical skills and then do the shooting. So I tend to be skeptical of what the military calls partial task trainers, where you just practice one part, and it's usually the hardest part of a skill in isolation. We're going to just do landings. Well, that's cool, but landings are one part of all the other things, right? You get a lot of reps that way, but you also are prone to a lot of false confidence that way. And we want to close the gap between enthusiasm and capability.
And there's a lot of things to unpack in all of this, right? So like, if you think about what Jim talked about, like they can shoot really well, but their weapon handling is dog shit. I mentioned the shoot house example. If I take people into a shoot house, their weapon handling was really good and safe on a range, but you go into shoot house and it falls apart, right? Like as an instructor, you use these to kind of throttle up and down training. And sometimes you have to like go back to the basics. You have to you put them in a new environment, some fundamental falls apart, you have to go back to it, right? And at the same time, you have to be careful about using some of this as an excuse for like that lowest common denominator training. You don't want to use crawl, walk, run. Like, well, we got to crawl before we can walk and run. It's like, well, yeah, but you're only crawling ever. You're never actually getting to that next level, right? You have to put it in the wall sometimes and find those points of failure at some point, or you're not going to get anywhere, right? But there's also a lot to be said about like keeping the joy in the training and keeping training fun. You want to give people a win. And like in my sense for guitar stuff, it's like, yeah, I got to take some time to I want to get better at playing guitar. I want to learn. I want to practice new skills and get more technical at times. But sometimes I just want to jam out, I just want to play something that I'm just like, I feel good about this and end on a win, right? End on something good. So you have to recognize where those diminishing returns are and when to call it for a day and be like, hey, you know what? All right, we've done enough work on stuff, but now I'm going to work on just having a little bit of fun, ending on a good note, on a high note. And this is where that attitude and joy and self-image comes into it. Like that mindset stuff is you want to enjoy this, right? You want to make it successful and build that into people.
Also end it in a game, end it in a competition, end it in a reward, but you got to get to the positive.
Yeah.
Right.
And all that being said, you still have to recognize that the hardest part is to start. There's still something to be said about hard work and grit and tenacity and resilience, and you need to trust the process. There are going to be roadblocks and obstacles and plateaus. You got to work hard to get through that. So stick with it.
Agreed. I would also offer trust the process, trust the process, trust the process. I'm saying that largely to myself. The hardest part is to start, but then you have to fight your way through all those hills and valleys on the learning curve. And it's okay to suck. That's fine. You're going to suck a little bit. And getting through that is where you get to greatness. All right. Be safe out there. Be smart out there. We're cheering you on.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.